Carrie. Carrie, collective impact recognizes that complex social and environmental issues, like the opioid epidemic, cannot be solved by one sector alone. What exactly is collective impact?
So collective impact was first introduced in 2011 in a journal article by Connie and Kramer. It includes 5 key components: a common agenda to make sure everyone's on the same page and moving towards the same goals, shared progress measures so everyone knows how progress and success will be assessed, mutually reinforcing activities to make sure that our activities are complementing one another and there are no gaps or duplications in communities, continuous communication to ensure the sharing of information in an organized and consistent manner, and finally a backbone organization to act as the facilitator and the system integrator and to keep everyone on the path moving forward. And when you combine all 5 of these components, you create a structure or the scaffolding to approach the work, plan for the work, and finally move the work forward.
Thank you. Next, for Tessa, I wanted to ask, one key component of collective impact is having a backbone to facilitate the work and act as a system integrator. Who is serving as the backbone organizations for Cohort 1 and Cohort 2, and why is it necessary for a backbone to support this work?
The backbone support of our Cohort 1 and Cohort 2 communities represent the unique needs and environment of each community. This may be the health department in some of our communities, it could be coalitions, other community organizations, or our mental health and recovery services boards. The backbone support is vital to continuing this work. If we are to do the hard and important work of working across sectors to solve complex issues on a large scale, we need a centralized support to keep our work going and make sure our initiatives are not becoming fragmented and disjointed. The backbone support does just this. The backbone support, like our own backbone, provides both flexibility and rigidity. While your own backbone serves as a pillar to support your body weight, the backbone support of collective impact is a flexible pillar that convenes collaborative partners to advance the common agenda while ensuring everyone impacted by the issue is both supported and present. By supporting this work across sectors, the backbone supports our work moving beyond a single program or service and supports us to intentionally shift a system. The ability to look across systems is essential for the backbone support, and what is unique to the backbone support of collective impact is that the emphasis on collaboration spans across community sectors. So rather than having representation of unique individuals involved from one sector, like education, for example, we're ensuring that everyone across sectors are representative. Collective impact says we want everyone impacted to be at the table, generating innovative solutions with us, and the backbone support facilitates this process.
Thank you. I next wanted to ask Matt to speak to this. How did the leadership team work with communities to come up with a common agenda?
Our first step when this project began was to understand the scope of what was going to be needed for us to impact the opioid epidemic across Ohio and in our CCIM4C communities. We drew on a conceptual map created by researchers in California, and that helped us understand that really to have a lasting impact on the epidemic, we were going to need to address prevention, treatment, recovery, and a social determinant of health. This was an initial step that helped us really begin to develop that common agenda. Our second step was to create our theory of change for the CCIM4C initiative as a whole. We specified what we hoped to do, who would do it, how we would do it, the frameworks we would use, and the outcomes that we hope to achieve. Our theory of change really helped operationalize our common agenda for the project as a whole. And it really set the stage for everything that was going to come next. One of the most unique aspects of this initiative is that then our Cohort 1 communities, created a theory of change for their work as well. And what this really resulted in is a theory of change that had a common agenda for the project as a whole and a common agenda in each of our Cohort 1 communities.
Thank you, Matt. Next, I wanted to ask Dana to speak to this. Continuous communication is a tenet of collective impact, but what is implied under a collective impact approach is a functioning ecosystem. How does an ecosystem strengthen the work of collective impact, and how can Thrive be used to develop an ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you, David. So to answer your first question, I think the ecosystem, the value of the ecosystem is really in helping communities, helping initiatives really think intentionally about how they're aligning for action. And also to think about how are you going to take these disparate parts and move them in one integrated direction and in turn and move them forward as one integrated initiative. In terms of collective impact and how the ecosystem supports that, I think we know that continuous communication is a really important tenet of collective impact, and the ecosystem really requires that we think about how are we going to be communicating across all the different parts of the ecosystem. How are we going to create a healthy ecosystem through continuous communication? That's really important in terms of building trust and building relationships with your partners. And really it's all about thinking about how are you going to structure for success? How are you going to ensure that all the parts are working together and that all your partners have an opportunity to contribute and to feel inspired by the work they're doing. I think Thrive is a really important piece of this and really offers an opportunity for partners to think about how the social determinants are impacting their work. It offers an opportunity for them to really think about it at a deeper level of prevention and to think about new ways of partnering and really engaging new and old partners.
Okay, thank you, Dana. My next question is for Tracy, and I want you to speak to this, Tracy. Common progress measures and mutually reinforcing activities are also important components of collective impact. How are communities using the strategic planning framework to ensure common progress measures and mutually reinforcing activities across the continuum of care?
Thank you, David. One of the key pieces about the strategic planning framework is that it is the essence of true validity and process. The strategic planning framework provides the communities to really look across all key continuums, from prevention, promotion, through treatment, intervention, and recovery. And the communities have been utilizing this in order, within their strategic plan maps, to have a structure in place that will enable them to really move forward collectively with values, activities, and goals in place that they can all work together and yet hold each other accountable. We find that when you hold each other accountable, the plan really becomes a true plan for true outcomes that will result from utilizing the strategic plan framework. We also know that the strategic plan framework and the plans that the community have developed really provides an opportunity for validity and for opportunity for measurement and engagement of others that are not involved in the community and can really begin to see that those strategic plans give them somewhat of strength and effort. The CCIM4C communities have really worked hard on their plans in order to really move forward and really move this plan, their activities in a place that will utilize themselves for the next few years.
Thank you, Tracy. Next, I wanted to ask Holly to speak to this. As a community of practice, we learned that opiate use and abuse is a wicked problem. What are the characteristics of a wicked problem? How is framing the opioid epidemic as a wicked problem helpful as communities work to address this issue?
The term wicked problems was coined by Horace Vertel and Melvin Weber in 1973. We call social problems such as the opioid epidemic wicked because they are vicious, like a circle, tricky, like a leprechaun, or aggressive, like a lion. These problems are wicked because they are never solved. They're only resolved. over and over again. This solving and resolving process requires communities to work together strategically, across and within systems in order to generate the most culturally relevant and sustainable approach to address the wicked problem at hand. Rattel and Weber offer 10 properties of wicked problems. The first property is that there is no definitive formulation of wicked problems. What that means is that the first step in addressing a wicked problem is actually framing the problem. In order to describe a wicked problem, you actually need to consider possible ideas for solving it. And by solving it, we don't mean specific detailed strategies. Instead, we mean creating an approach to work on the issue. For example, with the opioid epidemic, we knew the solution had to include prevention, supply reduction, demand reduction, and harm reduction. We knew it had to include treatment, and we knew it had to include recovery. But we knew all of those things, while they are necessary, were not sufficient. We also knew that we needed to address the community trauma and social determinants of health that were associated with the opioid epidemic. By framing a wicked problem, communities can then move forward with planning in a purposeful and intentional manner.
This is for Ruben. Through this process, we also learned that while prevention, treatment, and recovery are necessary to combat the opioid epidemic, they are not sufficient. Communities are facing multiple wicked problems and must also look at social determinants of health within their communities. How did looking at the social determinants of health enrich this project? How did considering community trauma fit into this project?
Thanks, David. So I think being able to think about social determinants of health really helped folks in this community to be able to go a little bit deeper and start asking the questions around what is actually driving the epidemic beyond what we usually think about as driving an epidemic. And be able to ask those questions not only of themselves, but also of folks within their communities. And then once we were able to ask those questions, it then allowed us to go a little bit more broadly, and using that lens of community trauma helped us to kind of consider a fuller picture of the community and look at those things that might be impacting the epidemic beyond what we usually think about. So it opened up opportunities to start thinking about economic opportunity and living wages, or housing, or social connections, which I know became such a huge issue for so many folks that are part of the CCIM4C project. And I think that's kind of put folks in a better place to be able to think about how we address this current epidemic, but also how we can address other crises as they arise, other crises that are emerging, and other challenges that folks might be facing as well.
Thank you, Ruben. I wanted to ask Raylette, CCIM4C communities have worked hard over the past 2 years to create a community-driven response to the opioid epidemic based on the tenets of collective impact. Why is it important for communities to plan for sustainability after the end of this project?
Thank you, David. I think the communities have done a fabulous job with the work they have been doing thus far over the past 2 years to create a community-driven opioid response. I think it is so important to plan for sustainability. I love the fact what the communities have done. They have brought together key partners, key stakeholders to really begin to put together a plan and, to address the response. It is so important to begin now to look at planning for sustainability, because as we think about all the great work that you have done thus far, how do we begin to look at sustaining the outcomes of the great work that you have done thus far? I think that is so important. And so the communities, the CCIM4C communities, they have begun to plan now, bringing all the partners together to see now how can we sustain certain outcomes such as education to really keep our communities thriving and moving forward with this process.
Our first question is going to be for Rick. What importance has the leadership from the technical assistance team brought to the community collective process?
Thank you, Amanda. I'm new to the prevention world, and so when the concept of community collective impact came together, it's like, what's that? And so from the very first week, we had access to our technical assistance team by telephone. They assured me that they would be here with me in this process to help us deliver a product that is meaningful for our community that we can follow for years to come. And so multiple phone calls and reassurance from them helped me better understand the language and the goals and the mission of the community collective impact model for change.
Thank you. Second question is going to go to Jennifer. What leadership role has your backbone organization played in the collective impact process?
Well, in Columbiana County, the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board served as the backbone organization. And we were responsible for deciding which stakeholders were going to be at the table and which role each of those stakeholders were going to play. Once we had everybody at the table, we had to make sure that they had an understanding of the collective impact process and the role that they were going to play. And then we wanted to create an environment that was inviting and helped make everybody comfortable sharing their input and their ideas from their perspective. And that day, we really built the cohesiveness of the group by doing that, and we developed our common agenda. And we came up with a lot of ideas that day, and then the role of the board became to kind of take those ideas and sift through them and see which data we had to back up the strategies that were proposed. And we had a lot of ideas, but some of them just didn't have the data to back up the need. So then it just became a data-driven process where we determined which needs were the greatest, and those were the strategies that we decided to go with and could implement. And then we used that data as our baseline for measuring outcomes in the future.
Thank you. Next, Leah. What effective leadership styles in your work and your collective impact?
Thank you. I think with collective impact, the goal is to get everyone to row the boat in the same way. I think there are several leadership qualities that are important. I think one of them that comes to mind for me is being a boundary spanner, being able to speak different languages, because we're trying to bring a whole variety of people together that may speak different languages. So you need somebody in that leadership role that's able to understand people's differences, appreciate those differences, and kind of explain it to the group as a whole. So I think that's one thing that comes to mind. I think another one is being inclusive. It kind of relates to the first one I just talked about, but really trying to include everybody that is impacted by the collective impact issue that you're addressing, and making sure that they feel welcome, that they feel that they can be honest, and that the leader can be trusted, and really listening to what everybody has to say.
Thank you. Fourth question, Susan. Keeping skills, attitudes, and knowledge in mind, how have we presented the initiative to community to bring them to the table?
I think that having the ability to recognize individuals in the community and recognize their special skills and their knowledge and their attitudes has been, that's an ability of mine, and I think that that's been really helpful in building our team and with our CCIM4C project, moving forward, with our project. So having the opportunity to work with impact prevention in Lawrence County and being the coordinator of the River Hills Prevention Connection, our local coalition, has certainly given me the opportunity to exercise that skill that I have to bring the diverse knowledge and skills and attitudes together to make this work. We have developed strategies and have been fortunate enough to implement some of those in our community, and being able to pull the business leadership, and maybe social services, the leadership there, and our prevention team has really worked, and it's been an exciting opportunity. So not only recognizing leadership in the community, we are building leaders, and our youth-led team has been involved with what we've done so far, so it's really been successful. So it's been a great exercise, been very difficult to learn, but now I see it as a valuable tool to move forward.
Thank you.
So Tazeen, why is a strategic planning process important?
So a strategic planning is important to an organization because it provides a sense of direction and outlines measurable goals. It also provides a clear direction for the overall organization, bringing the subcommittees together collectively, and provides a clear place for where organizations can fit into the process. Strategic planning is a tool that is useful for guiding day-to-day decisions, for subcommittees to work towards their particular strategy, and also for evaluating progress and changing approaches when moving forward with the plan.
And what do you need to have to get started in your strategic planning process?
Data. Data is important because it's a way to describe the community and what is happening in order to define your problem. Data can provide a more accurate picture of the community than anecdotal information or perceptions. It's critical to know what data is available and where to find it. Sharing and developing a common set of data is important for collaborative efforts. Data provides a clear focus and helps to set goals, and helps also to avoid the detours caused by things that don't fit. Data can show impact. Did the plan accomplish what it set out to do? And does the plan need to be tweaked along the way? Data is an important way to measure those things.
Tiffany, as you begin a strategic planning process, what partners do you need to have at the table, and how do you engage them?
So anyone who would like to be involved in the community, that would like to collaborate or contribute to the solution. You want to connect and create new relationships while you're working to maybe renew or revive old ones or past ones. Each partner comes together and you want to form a cohesive team because each person, entity, contributes to a different piece. How we did it in our county, we sent out a lot of emails, invitations. We connected with them verbally, and then we also built a team based on who they know and how they can engage them and who they are already working with.
How do you complete a strategic plan?
So there are various elements to consider when you're completing the strategic plan map. And one of them was spoken earlier and about the data piece, and that's what's going to drive that whole process. Two is identifying your goals, your statement, so that you can hone in on your problem of practice and your priority population. Next, you will be looking at causal factors as well as root causes. You'll be digging into your community, and that there's a place for that on the map. Once you determine those, you'll be identifying strategies, lead agencies, and budgeting for your work. Also, the strategic timeline is important because you'll be working through the theory of community change to impact both shorter and longer term outcomes.
Strategic plan map.
So to complete a strategic plan map, it worked for us as most effective to include our partners, involving them in the process. In Fairfield County, we broke the map down into sections, and that seemed to be more helpful for the group and less overwhelming. We then brainstormed the causal factors, and then asked that important question, but why here? To brainstorm our more specific root causes. So the strategic map also addresses those measurable goals that are not only short-term, but mid-term, and then the overall goal. The strategy piece was done last, and again, the group brainstormed and prioritized those evidence-based strategies for us to use in the strategic plan map.
And how do you identify strategies in your strategic planning process?
Well, the first thing I would say is don't hurry. And it was really hard for our group in Fairfield County to not jump into coming up with strategies before we completed the plan. everybody has some solution to the problem being that without looking at the overall picture, you're just sort of spraying water on a burning fire without attacking it in the most effective way. So we broke Fairfield County Task Force down into subcommittees, and we had advocacy, prevention, education, treatment, recovery supports, and advocacy. We knew that stigma was going to be an issue across the board in all the subcommittees. And each subcommittee developed its own set of strategies for the specific things that were identified that people wanted to accomplish. So we have one larger group that meets for a half an hour and we talk about the work that we're doing, and sometimes we provide education, and then that second half an hour we break the subcommittees down and they're able to work in their particular area. So yeah, I think that the biggest thing for us, again, was just not jumping in and coming up with strategies without looking at the overall planning process.
Tommy, what lessons learned came from engaging in the CCIM4C strategic planning process?
Well, I think there have been lots of lessons learned. Specific to the strategic planning process, I'd like to highlight 4. First is keeping in mind some other community planning processes that might be happening. Many local health departments are working on community health improvement plans. Hospitals work on community health assessments. So keeping those in mind and working with those other assessment efforts can help reduce redundancy and help to ensure that your plan is aligned with other things that are going on in the community. The second thing is understanding that the strategic planning documents are living documents. So they're constantly going to be changing. So you can really use those strategic planning documents as a progress checker and revise those as necessary to keep up with what's happening in your community. I would say think about ways to engage new partners, but also old partners in new ways. So how can current partners that you may be working with, what are other ways you might be able to engage with them that you've not thought about, or other ways that they can contribute to the process where they may not have contributed in the past? And then I would say celebrate some short-term goals and some short-term wins. I think it's important. A lot of times we get bogged down in the overall goal or the end goal, and we forget to celebrate some of those short-term, some of those easy wins.
Stacy, can you tell us about ACER? What is the difference between community and individual level trauma?
Sure. So coined by the Prevention Institute, the term ACER is actually a tool that helps communities identify adverse community experiences and their resilience. It's used to help communities to develop strategies that promote community healing and foster resilience. When we think about trauma, we know that trauma occurs on both an individual and a community level. And when it occurs on an individual level, we often ask, what has happened to them? And at a community level, we might ask things like, what is keeping them from rebounding or recovering from what has happened? So when we think about trauma in general, we know that they are experiences and situations that are extremely emotionally painful. And for individuals, revisiting that trauma, becoming avoidant, having difficulty with emotional numbness, and becoming easily aroused can lead to violence. We know at community levels, when traumas happen across our social and cultural platforms, our physical environments, and our economic environments, it can also contribute to the production of violence, especially when communities do not have the capacity to organize to address it. They become frustrated, which can also lead to violence. So it's important that for us, looking at how wicked problems exist in our community, how to help our community break that cycle of unhealthy community deterioration, that we understand the different levels of trauma and what type of trauma exists in our community.
Thank you. Elaine, what is THRIVE? What does it stand for and how is it used?
Thank you, Ruben. THRIVE is a framework that can help you look at different factors in the community that impact health and safety. THRIVE stands for the Tool for Health and Resilience in Vulnerable Environments. It is broken down into 3 clusters: people, places, and equitable opportunities.
Great. So now we're going to talk a little bit about each of those clusters. Ashley, can you describe the people cluster?
The people cluster, you're thinking of the culture and social norms in the community and how they can contribute to trauma. Strategies to promote community healing and resilience involve identifying and connecting with individuals, with building trust and fixing disconnected or damaged relationships.
Courtney, can you talk a little bit about the place cluster?
Yes. So an example of some of the places symptomatic of community trauma include housing, transportation, our parks, industry. We can take a look at housing a little closer. In Lucas County, we see boarded up properties from drug raids. We see abandoned properties turned into shooting galleries. We see full shelters and homeless camps, and we see long waiting lists for public housing assistance and the demand for recovery housing. So what do? We acknowledge how these potential partners have been impacted by the opioid crisis. And from them, we start a conversation and we gather their data, we get their perspective, their strengths, their expertise, and their resources, and we have an opportunity to form a unique and creative partnership. We engage them to form strategies that will end up being mutually beneficial, all while working on our common agenda.
Great, thank you. Adam, can you describe how systems are impacted by these issues and also talk a little bit about the equitable opportunity cluster?
Sure. Like Stacy said earlier, trauma is an event, a series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful and has lasting adverse effects. Trauma is associated strongly with chronic behavioral and physical health conditions, making trauma a harmful and costly public health concern. And the question we should be asking is not whether or not our communities have experienced trauma, but how has community trauma impacted our systems? And so when we start to look at this as a systems issue, not just an individual issue or a family issue, or any one segment of the community, but an entire system. One of those resiliency factors is having and enhancing equitable opportunities. This includes educational opportunities from early childhood all the way up, and having employers in the community who offer living wage jobs and have opportunities for advancement and advanced training.
Great, thank you. Cynthia, can you tell us why it's important to think at the community level?
Yes, when we're looking at working together across our entire community, a couple of the main advantages are that we can identify gaps in our programs and services, and we can also prevent duplication of efforts. Sometimes in this process, you'll hear an analogy to silos, and silos are towers where we store grain. So someone planted a seed, they harvested the product, and it's really some good stuff in that silo. But with this CCIM4C process, we'll come together. It's kind of like we're sharing what we've stored up, rather than staying kind of behind closed doors with all the good stuff. We come out to share it. And it also gives us a shared language, community level strategies, acknowledge the value of all sectors of our community. And it also recognizes the diversity in our experiences and also our ways of thinking. So a community approach can increase capacity, which we're looking at resources and readiness. And then we have to ask ourselves, are we really ready to do this? Are we ready to address the issue? And probably more importantly, are we ready and willing to work together?
Great, thank you. And Hamza, can you tell us a little bit about how coalitions can approach these issues with key stakeholders in the community?
You have to articulate the issue in a way that relates to them, whether indirectly or directly. For example, the faith community may have individuals in their congregation with issues such as addiction, or how having a drug-free community can increase productivity for employers.
Thank you all very much.
Talking about the 5 elements of collective impact. Now we're going to talk about what the 5 elements of collective impact actually looks like in each community. Tracy, could you tell us how the backbone organization looks in your community?
Sure. Okay. So initially we talked about what the role of the backbone would be. I'm from the Mental Health and Recovery Board at Green-Madison, and so prior to actually the initiative starting, we thought about it was a natural sort of role that we play in a community. So often boards, and in our case, we convene a lot of folks across systems. So it felt like a natural fit for the collective impact process or project for us to be a backbone organization. We didn't really know what that meant and how that was different from how we were practicing prior to the collective impact initiative, but began thinking about, well, how do we know it's working and what role do we actually play? So it's beyond just convening folks. It's kind of holding up the process of the collective impact initiative. So it's the central nervous system of the project. So we had to begin looking at, well, how do we do that? So it's convening folks, it's thinking about the collective impact elements and holding the process accountable. So through how we share measurements and data, how we hold up the key elements of the key element of continuous communication. So what does that look like? What is it going to look like for our project? How do you know it's working? It's really aligning the strategies and vision with the project and the initiative. So how do we know it's working? Beginning to think about what the outputs of that are and how people are working, aligning the shared measurements and the vision and strategy. So I think we didn't really know what the backbone role was going to be until we started moving through it and learning more about it. And it's in our community, it's really kind of holding people true to the process of the collective impact initiative.
Amanda, what does shared measurement look like in your community?
Yeah, so originally we found that, in the past, our community partners were very reluctant to share their data. They kind of kept hold of it pretty tight because they weren't sure how it was going to be used and how it was going to make them look. And we found through this process that we really actually kind of created a culture of data sharing, which has been really nice. And this was not an easy process. When we initially threw out that question of, hey, give us your data, no one responded to our email. And so it was really hard at first. We're like, well, we know that people have data. Where is it? Why aren't they sending it to us? And so we had to go through the process of learning how to ask the right questions to get what we needed. And so once we really figured out that process of how to frame the question, all of that data really started to flow in, which was really nice. And then kind of in addition to all of that, I think that once we identified those key data indicators that we were going to follow on the different strategic plan maps, it really has helped us to not only know, but also share what the doing is actually doing. And that's been a big help through this process.
Joanna, what does a common agenda look like in your community?
So to start with, whenever we're doing any kind of group work or team projects, one of the keys to success is that everyone understands the strategy we're going to follow and what roles each person will play. So the common agenda for our community consists of our strategic plan maps, which give a picture of what our strategy will be, hence the name. Our theory of change, which helps to encompass the rationale and again the key players, as well as our ecosystem, which highlights our key players and potential players. So within our community, what we found is that our common agenda is something that is written out in these documents. It is transferable to new participants in the initiative, which can be either newly engaged partners or folks such as myself who ended up joining midway through. What that allows us to do is to refer to the documents to see what the history is and what the future is supposed to look like. Then each person can identify what their role will be and how they'll play that role within the team.
Christy, what does continuous communication look like in your community?
Continuous communication for us actually has many levels to it. The basic form of it is constantly sharing information with the organizations involved. Generally, for us, we communicate a lot through email. So that basic communication, sharing constantly. For us also, it is that process of setting up bylaws or rules amongst your group to share at your meetings themselves to make sure conflict can be easily resolved and that there are a set of standards and processes to follow at the meetings themselves. Also, constant talk about our goals out in the community, sharing at other meetings. In my line of work, or all of our line of work, we go to various meetings that are constantly talking about similar things. So sharing that agenda out and about to gain possible new partners and to make sure we're not overlapping our efforts. It may also mean a way of sharing and being a part of your coalition without attending meetings. We have a number of organizations who just say, I cannot sit in another meeting, but they can share in another way, providing data or different resources that we don't normally have if they're not present.
Bridget, what does mutually reinforcing activities look like in your community?
When Ashtabula County started the collective impact process, I can imagine that much like other communities, we already had a lot of organizations or individuals or community services that were contributing to what ended up being our strategic activities. So there were already events in place, there were already activities happening in our community that contributed to solving our wicked problem. So the collective impact process allowed us to identify those individuals, those organizations that were already having community activities or services, and allowing us to fit that into our strategic plan. But also it allowed us to see where the gaps were and then be able to develop new and novel activities that might help fill in those gaps.
Tracy, how has using these 5 elements in combination changed the way that you do your work?
So when I think about how collective impact is really impacted the work that we've been doing, it has a lot to do with enhancing what was the collaborations that were already occurring in our community. So taking it beyond collaborative partnerships to really measure it against the elements and thinking about it through the lens of collective impact has helped us do that. So how do you, we talked about mutually reinforcing activities, so not just talking about things we do together toward a common end, but how do we know we're working together? How are we aligning the efforts? And how do we talk about through continuous communication and when activities aren't necessarily mutually reinforcing? So that comes up too, and sometimes that's a difficult conversation to have, but it's important. We wouldn't talk about it otherwise. So how do systems that are working together all of a sudden through this collective impact process align the work? And I think that's how you know that things are working in a better way, that the systems are doing this work better together, is when we begin to not kind of do parallel process, but all of a sudden we're doing things in a way and we're keeping in mind what the shared agenda is. So we're keeping in mind how does our criminal justice partner and our education partner and our health system partners, how are we doing work that's moving toward a common kind of shared end? How are we thinking about activities that are happening, not just as activities and strategies, but really kind of coalescing the work. And I think it's hard to know that the work is working. It's hard to measure the part of the process through collective impact that doesn't get you to you're not to the tangible end yet. It's thinking about how are our systems sharing a language all of a sudden? How are we having conversations around what's supportive to the initiative versus our own agenda? It's creating policy through the conversations that we're having with collective impact. It's thinking about all of a sudden how what we're doing is impacting our system partners and how we're shifting in a way to do the work together and bringing together our strengths and in a mutually reinforcing kind of way. So really the 5 elements help you not just superficially do collective impact, but it helps you, if you think about it, measure the work too. So it is part of the process of measuring. So all 5 elements are helpful in that regard if you use them as the lens to do the work. So that's one way. That's 5 ways. A bunch of ways.